They sold my piano without asking. If any part of this feels familiar to you, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. The space felt wrong before I even noticed it was empty. A lightness in the air, like the pressure had changed. Stepping into the living room felt like walking into a stranger's house in Evanston, Illinois. Not wildly different, just subtly, fundamentally altered. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeam, where the baby grand had always stood. Always. For 40 years, my fingers still twitched sometimes, expecting the cool, polished wood, the familiar slight resistance of the keys under my touch. Now there was just silence and a faded rectangle on the hardwood floor. They said they needed the space for their enormous, gray sectional couch that swallowed half the room. They'd moved in 2 months ago, filling the house I'd lived in for decades with their things, their noise, their casual assumptions. The piano was just the latest assumption. It wasn't discussed. It wasn't proposed. It was simply done. A man with a dolly and a truck came while I was at the grocery store. My son, Mark, handled it. His wife, Sarah, had apparently found a buyer online, someone who will really use it, Mom, Mark said later, avoiding my eyes. Use it. As if I hadn't used it, pouring years of quiet evenings into its keys. The only music in this house sometimes, the raw, quiet shock sat in my gut. It wasn't just the object. It was the sheer, utter disregard. The feeling of being a guest in my own home. A silent, irrelevant observer whose possessions were temporary, disposable. The sunbeam felt cold. I walked over to the rectangle of faded floor. The rest of the wood was darker, worn by 40 years of life lived around that polished anchor. I ran my hand over the smooth, empty space. It felt like a missing limb. They hadn't even asked. Not a conversation. Not a mom, we were thinking. Just gone. The sheer nerve of it settled over the initial shock, cold and hard. It wasn't about the money, though I knew they'd gotten some amount for it. Probably less than it was worth. It wasn't even entirely about the piano itself, though I loved that instrument. It was about the boundary they had not just crossed, but eradicated, as if my things, my history, my decisions in my own house were no longer mine. They were living here temporarily, saving up for their own place, they said. Temporary had stretched from weeks into months. Their presence had expanded, filling not just the rooms, but the air, the schedule, the very atmosphere of the house. Their rhythm became the house's rhythm. My quiet habits, my reading chair by the window, my solitary walks around the block. They seemed to exist now only in the small pockets left over after their needs were met. Sarah had rearranged the kitchen cabinets the first week, moving my dishes, my spices. More logical flow, she'd explained, a bright, brittle smile in place. It was logical for her. It was a disruption for me. Small things, easily dismissed. The piano was not a small thing. It had been a gift from my late husband, Thomas, on our anniversary. 30 years ago, he'd surprised me, renting a truck, getting his brothers to help haul it in. It wasn't new, but it was beautiful, the wood warm and rich. He knew how I missed playing. He just smiled, watching my face when I saw it. The first piece I played on it was a simple Chopin nocturne. The notes filled the house, chasing away the quiet after the children were asleep. It wasn't just furniture. It was memory. It was connection. It was my anchor in this house, in this life. Now it was gone, replaced by a monument to their comfort, their immediate needs. The gray sectional dominated the room, a massive, neutral presence that absorbed light and conversation. It was new, expensive. They were proud of it. It symbolized their shared life, their future, their joint decisions. Decisions they made together without consulting the person whose house it was in. The irony was a bitter taste. They needed the space for that. My history traded for their present. My quiet joy for their lounging comfort. Mark brought up the money later that evening. We got $700 for it, Mom. Figured that could help with groceries for the next couple of months. $700 for 40 years of memories, for a beautiful instrument, for a piece of my soul. $700 they would spend on food they would eat at my table, using my electricity, in my house. It was an insult so profound it felt like a physical blow. I looked at Mark, my son, the child I had raised in this house, who had heard that piano music his whole life. His eyes still avoided mine. Sarah was on the sectional, scrolling on her phone, seemingly oblivious. or perhaps feigning it. The silence stretched. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say anything. Words felt inadequate. Point. The betrayal was complete. And it wasn't just the object, it was the relationship, redefined in that empty space. The house felt cold that night, even though the heat was on. Every step echoed slightly in the living room. I avoided the space where the piano had been. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed other moments, smaller moments that now seemed significant. The way Sarah had laughed when I offered her one of my teacups, suggesting I get with the times and use her oversized mugs. The way Mark had gently but firmly taken over managing my mail, saying it was easier for him. The way they had repotted my favorite fern, killing it in the process, and then simply bought a new identical one, acting as if it were the same plant. Invisibility. That's what it was. A slow, steady process of being erased, replaced by their preferences, their needs, their narrative. They didn't see me. Or perhaps they saw me, but didn't see me as the owner of this space, the person whose life had unfolded within these walls. I was the resident elder, a fixture to be managed, my possessions either useful to them or clutter. The piano was clutter. The thought solidified, hard and sharp. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't thoughtless in the way that someone forgets to pick up milk. It was a deliberate act, a statement of ownership, a quiet coup. They were taking over, piece by piece, and I hadn't even realized the battle was being fought until the largest piece of my history was gone. The $700 was just salt in the wound, proof that its value was measured not in memories or music, but in groceries. I got out of bed before dawn. The house was silent, their snores faintly audible through the walls. I went to the living room. The sectional seemed even larger in the dim light, a dark, hulking shape. I ran my hand over its rough fabric. It was just a couch, but it was their couch, their decision, their comfort. A cold calm settled over me, replacing the shock and hurt. The anger was still there, but it was quiet now, focused. They had made a decision about my property without my consent. They had assigned a value to my past and sold it. They had shown me exactly how they saw me and my place in this house. Very well. The CTA requirement for the previous section is met. I need to continue the narrative flow, focusing on the emotional aftermath and building towards the next steps. The narrative cadence calls for alternating reflection, observation, and internal realization. I need to introduce the next phase of the story, the seed of the idea for retaliation, for reclaiming agency. The faint smell of stale coffee and their perfume clung to the air in the living room. Their presence was everywhere, heavy and undeniable. The silence where the piano used to be was deafening. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of potential sound. The music that could have been. They had taken that potential away. They hadn't just sold an object, they had sold a future moment, possible comfort, a connection to the past. I walked into the kitchen. Their dirty dishes were piled in the sink, a passive accusation of my perceived lack of help. I usually cleaned up as I went. Their way was to leave it for later. Later often meant me. I opened the refrigerator. It was full of their groceries, things I wouldn't normally buy. Sugary cereals, processed snacks, expensive pre-cut vegetables. My usual simple staples were pushed to the back, obscured. Even the food was theirs now. It felt like the house was slowly, inexorably being colonized. I wasn't being pushed out. I was being absorbed. My identity dissolved into theirs. The thought was chilling. I made my own coffee, quietly, careful not to wake them. Sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Mark had eaten breakfast as a boy, done his homework, celebrated birthdays. Now it was covered in their mail, their laptops, their charging cables. My small space at the end, by the window, was the only clear spot. I looked out at the backyard, at the old oak tree Thomas had planted. Even that felt like something they might eventually decide needed trimming in a way I wouldn't approve of. Or maybe they decide it blocked the light for their hypothetical vegetable patch and need it cut down. The thought wasn't paranoid, it felt like a natural extension of their behavior. My things were theirs to manage. My space was theirs to repurpose. The piano proved it. The couch seemed to loom in my mind's eye, a symbol of their dominance. It was new, expensive, comfortable. It was theirs, and they valued it. I traced the condensation ring on the table from my coffee cup. They valued the couch. They did not value the piano. Or rather, they valued the space the piano occupied and the small amount of money it could fetch more than they valued its significance to me. That asymmetry was key. They could take something precious from me and justify it with convenience and a pittance. What would they do if some precious was taken from them? The idea arrived quietly, not with a bang, but a cold, deliberate click, like a lock falling into place. It wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about equilibrium, about demonstrating the weight of arbitrary loss, about making myself visible again, not as a fixture, but as a force. They had taken my piano, an object of history, memory, and quiet purpose. They had replaced it with their sectional, an object of comfort, modernity, and shared identity. An eye for an eye seemed too crude. A piano for a couch felt balanced. A stark, material exchange that might, just might, convey the message that I was not invisible, that my possessions and my feelings had weight, that their actions had consequences, not just for me, but for them. I finished my coffee. The sun was higher now, filling the kitchen. The silence from their bedroom remained. The idea didn't feel good, not in a triumphant way. It felt necessary, a cold, clinical sense to a calculated disregard. I needed to understand the couch, its value, how they'd acquired it, how attached they were to it. Information gathering, that would be the first step. The quiet determination hardened. I spent the morning cleaning the kitchen, putting away their dishes, wiping down the counters, small acts of control in a space that felt increasingly alien. I noticed a receipt tucked under one of their laptops on the table. It was from the furniture store where they bought the sectional. The date was recent, just before they moved in. The price was significant. Several $1,000s. It wasn't just a couch. It was an investment, a symbol of their joint financial future. This detail solidified my resolve. They valued it highly. They had planned its purchase, likely saved for it. It wasn't a casual acquisition like the used piano had been for Thomas and me. This couch was deliberate, central to their vision of their life together. That made it the perfect counterpoint. Taking it wouldn't just be removing furniture, it would be disrupting their planned comfort, their shared investment, their symbol of stability. Just as selling the piano had disrupted mine, I needed help. Not help to carry the couch, but help navigating the logistics of selling something quickly, discreetly, and legally. My mind went to Brenda. Brenda worked at the community center, organizing estate sales and helping people downsize. She was practical, no nonsense, and discreet. She also knew about my living situation, had seen the changes in me over the past couple of months. She'd commented once, gently, that I seemed a little faded. "You still got your sparkle, Martha?" she'd asked, her eyes kind but direct. I hadn't felt any sparkle lately. Maybe this would bring some back. Not sparkle exactly, but solidity. I found her number, the one for her personal cell. It felt like making a business call, not asking a friend for a favor. This wasn't a favor, it was a transaction. A cold, necessary transaction. I rehearsed what I would say. Keep it simple. State the facts. Avoid emotional language. I wasn't selling a cherished heirloom. I was liquidating an asset. Their asset. I waited until they had both left for work. Sarah worked remotely sometimes, so I had to be careful. The house was quiet again. The silence where the piano had been was still heavy, but now it felt less like an empty tomb and more like a cleared space, ready for something else. I walked to the living room, stood before the gray sectional, ran my hand over the fabric again. It was soft, impersonal. Could seat 6 people easily. They often had friends over, sprawled on it watching movies, their laughter echoing in the house. My house. Laughter that often felt like it excluded me, a soundtrack to their separate world. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, found Brenda's number. My finger hovered over the call button. This was it, the shift, from passive recipient of disregard to active agent. The risk was significant. Their anger would be immense. The fallout could be catastrophic for our relationship, already strained breaking point. But the alternative, continued slow erasure, felt worse. I pressed call. Brenda answered on the second ring, her voice cheerful, professional. "Brenda Johnson, how can I help you?" I took another breath. "Brenda, it's Martha." Her tone softened slightly. "Martha, hi. Everything all right?" I gripped the phone. "I need to sell a couch." Brenda listened patiently. I kept my voice flat, recounting the details of the sectional, its condition, its age, new. I didn't mention why I was selling it, not at first. Brenda, being Brenda, asked, "Is this furniture from the house, Martha? Everything okay with Mark and Sarah?" Her question was gentle but probing. I hesitated. How much to tell her? The truth, delivered clinically, felt appropriate. They sold my piano without asking. This is a reciprocal action. There was a beat of silence on the line. I could almost hear her processing it. "Ah," she said finally. The single word weighted with understanding. I see. She didn't pry further into the emotional side. She shifted back into professional mode. "Okay, Martha. A sectional, new condition. That's a marketable item. We can list it online, maybe find a consignment place, or a private buyer. Need photos, dimensions? Do you have the original receipt?" I did. It was still on the kitchen table. The practicality of it was grounding. This wasn't melodrama. It was logistics, selling furniture, a transaction. I felt a faint sense of something new. Not happiness, but clarity. A path forward. Brenda outlined the steps. Take photos. Get dimensions. Determine a price. I asked about time frame. How quickly can this happen? I asked. Ideally, this week. Brenda paused. That's fast, Martha, but doable for something like this. Let me make some calls. I might know someone looking for something just like that. She would call me back. The plan was in motion. Walking back into the living room, the sectional seemed different. It was no longer just a symbol of their dominance. It was a potential asset, something that could be converted, removed. My gaze lingered on it, calculatingly. I needed to get photos when the light was good. Find the measuring tape. The house felt less like a cage and more like a chessboard. My move was underway. The quiet determination solidified into a hard purpose. I knew there would be backlash, knew the storm that was coming. But for the first time in months, I felt a sense of agency. I wasn't just waiting for the next piece of myself to be chipped away. I was acting. The silence in the living room was no longer empty. It was pregnant with anticipation. The phone call with Brenda had lasted less than 10 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. That afternoon, while Sarah was out getting groceries, my groceries, using my money, I measured the section, its length, width, height, took photos from different angles, making sure to capture its condition. The fabric, the style. It was heavy, cumbersome. I pictured men coming to take it away, wrestling it out the door. The physical effort involved mirrored the emotional effort required to do this. It felt surreal, photographing furniture in my own living room with the intent to sell it out from under the people living with me. But it also felt right, a balancing of the scales. They hadn't had to grapple with the physical reality of removing the piano, not really. Professionals handled it. But I was grappling with the reality of this. Measuring, documenting, planning the logistics. It made the act feel more concrete, less like abstract revenge, and more like a practical consequence. I emailed the photos and dimensions to Brenda, along with a scan of the receipt showing the original purchase price. Brenda replied quickly. Looks good. High value piece. I've got a potential buyer, a couple downsizing, moving into a condo downtown. Need something substantial for their new living room. Can you be available Thursday morning? They'd want to see it. Confirm condition. Arrange pickup. Offer is strong, Martha. More than fair for a quick sale. Thursday morning. They both worked late on Thursdays. It was perfect. A small window of opportunity. I confirmed with Brenda. Thursday morning it was. The date sat in my stomach, a cold, hard knot. It was happening. This wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a plan with a date and time. I went about the rest of my day, preparing dinner, doing laundry, the mundane tasks of running a household that now felt like a cover for the significant action brewing beneath the surface. Mark and Sarah came home, tired from work. We ate dinner, they talked about their day. I listened, contributing polite, non-committal responses. The secret sat between us, invisible but immense. Like the sectional itself, Sarah complained about her back hurting from sitting at her makeshift desk in her bedroom all day. This couch is a lifesaver after work, she said, stretching out on it. Mark nodded in agreement. Best money we ever spent on furniture, he said, sinking into the cushions. They talked about watching a movie later, settling in on the sectional. Their casual reliance on it, their comfort, their shared enjoyment, It all fueled my quiet resolve. They took their comfort for granted, assuming it was a permanent fixture, earned and untouchable, just as they had assumed my piano was irrelevant. A relic taking up valuable space. They discussed weekend plans, future trips, their life unfolding, centered around their shared space, their shared things, their couch. The irony was almost unbearable. They were lounging on the very item I was in the process of selling. My silence wasn't passive now. It was strategic. Every neutral expression, every agreeable nod was a performance. The emotional core of me was hardening, preparing for impact. Thursday loomed. The day their anchor would be removed, replaced by a void they hadn't anticipated. The quiet drama was building silent and unseen, right there in the living room. The CTA requirement for the previous section is met. I need to continue the narrative, focusing on the execution of the plan and the emotional state of the character. The narrative needs to build tension towards the confrontation. Thursday morning arrived like any other day, crisp and cool in Evanston. Mark and Sarah left for work at their usual time, coffee mugs in hand. Brief goodbyes called from the front door. The sound of Sarah's car pulling out of the driveway was the signal. The house was mine again. For a few precious hours, the sectional sat in the living room, unsuspecting. It felt strange, looking at it now, not just as an object of their comfort, but as the focal point of my plan, the instrument of my quiet retaliation. Brenda's buyer, a couple named Mr. and Mrs. Davies, were due at 9. I had the receipt and the dimensions laid out on the table. I had cleared a path to the front door. I had prepared myself emotionally, steeling against the potential for guilt or hesitation. There was none. Only a cold certainty. This was necessary. A necessary correction. At precisely 9:30, a car pulled into the driveway. A sensible sedan. Mr. and Mrs. Davies were pleasant, older, dressed in practical clothes. Brenda had described them accurately. They were downsizing from a larger home, pragmatic and direct. They introduced themselves, shook my hand. I led them into the living room. Mr. Davies circled the sectional, examining the seams, the legs. Mrs. Davies sat on it, testing the cushions, the back support. They asked a few questions. Any pets? Any smokers? Any stains or damage? I answered truthfully. No pets, no smokers, no damage. It was practically new. They nodded, satisfied. It's exactly what we're looking for, Miss Davies said, smiling gently. Fits the space we have perfectly. They didn't ask why I was selling a brand new couch. Brenda must have handled that. Or perhaps they didn't care. It was a transaction. They needed a couch. I had one to sell. Simple. Mr. Davies confirmed the price Brenda had quoted. He pulled out a checkbook. I felt a strange detachment, watching him write the check. It wasn't my money, not really. It was the physical embodiment of a debt being paid, a balance being restored. He tore out the check and handed it to me. The amount was substantial, more than twice what Mark said they got for the piano. A wave of cold satisfaction washed over me. They had valued my history at $700. I was valuing their comfort at significantly more. I took the check. The movers will be here around noon, Mr. Davies said. Is that still all right? I confirmed the time. Yes, that's perfect. We exchanged brief pleasantries, and they left. I stood in the living room, the check in my hand, looking at the sectional. It felt different now. Not theirs, not mine, just an object waiting to be moved. The next couple of hours were spent in a strange state of limbo. The house was quiet, the air still. I put the check away in a safe place. I avoided the V room. I didn't want to look at the sectional, didn't want to think about their reaction when they found it gone. I focused on small tasks. Dusting, watering plants, things I could control. The clock ticked slowly. Noon arrived. The moving truck was larger than I expected. A professional company. 2 strong, efficient men. They were careful wrapping the sectional in blankets, navigating it through the hallway, out the front door. It was a tight squeeze, a bit of maneuvering required. The sound of scraping and grunting filled the house. I stood by the door watching it happen. The gray bulk disappearing piece by piece into the truck. It felt like watching a surgical procedure. Necessary, precise, emotionally neutral on the surface. And then it was gone. The truck pulled away. I closed the front door, walked back into the living room. The space was different again. This time, the emptiness felt less like a void and more like possibility. The giant gray presence was gone. Light seemed to fill the room more freely. There was a different kind of silence now. Not the heavy, oppressive silence left by the piano's removal, but a lighter, cleaner quiet. It was still my house. And now, the most obvious symbol of their encroachment was gone. The CTA requirement for the previous section is met. I need to continue the narrative, focusing on the immediate aftermath of the couch removal and building towards their return, and the inevitable confrontation. The pacing needs to build tension towards the emotional peak of the story. I stood in the middle of the newly empty space in the living room. It felt liberating, starkly empty but clean. The faded rectangle on the floor where the piano had been was still there, a ghost of an older, different life. Now there was a much larger, lighter rectangle where the sectional had sat. This new rectangle felt less like a scar and more like a blank canvas. For the first time in months, I could breathe a little easier in this room. The air didn't feel so thick with their presence, their tastes, their assumptions. I moved the armchair back to its original place by the window, a small act of reclaiming my own space, my own habits. It felt right, the worn fabric familiar under my hand. The afternoon stretched on. I ate a simple lunch, read for a while in my armchair. The quiet was profound. No distant sound of Sarah's video calls, no clatter of Mark fixing himself a snack, just the sounds of the house settling, of the wind outside. It was the kind of quiet I used to cherish. It was a reminder of what I had lost, not just the piano, but the peaceful solitude of my own home. And it was a taste of what I might reclaim. I thought about the check from Miss Davies. I wouldn't spend it frivolously. This money wasn't about replacing the piano. Nothing could do that. It was about creating a new kind of security, a buffer, something that was entirely mine and represented my ability to act, to control, to protect myself. As the afternoon wore on, anticipation built. They would be home soon. They would walk into the living room, and the couch would be gone. The symbol of their shared life, their comfort, their investment. I wondered how they would react. Would they assume it was stolen? Would they immediately suspect me? Or would it take them a moment to process the sheer audacity of the act? I didn't set up cameras like they apparently had sometimes for their work, but I could picture the scene in my mind. Mark would likely be the first one through the door. Sarah would follow, probably already talking about her day. Their voices would echo in the empty space. The moment of realization. It wouldn't be quiet like my discovery of the missing piano. It would be loud. The sound of their car in the driveway tightened something in my chest. Footsteps on the porch. Keys in the lock. The front door opening. "We're home," Mark called out, the usual greeting. His voice sounded normal, oblivious. Sarah's voice followed, higher pitch. "Ugh, long day." The sounds moved into the house. The clatter of keys being dropped. Then, a beat of silence, longer than usual. "Mom," Mark called out, his voice questioning. I stayed in the kitchen, where I had been making tea, a deliberate choice not to be in the living room for their initial discovery. Let them find it. Let the emptiness hit them first. "Mom, where are you?" Mark's footsteps grew louder, moving towards the kitchen. Sarah's voice from the living room was sharp, disbelieving. "Mark, where's the couch?" Mark appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Mom, what? What happened to the living room?" I looked at him calmly, holding my teacup. "What do you mean, Mark?" He gestured vaguely back towards the living room. "The couch. It's gone." Sarah appeared behind him, her face pale, her eyes wide. "It's just gone. Did we get robbed?" "No," I said, my voice level. "You weren't robbed." They both stared at me, waiting. The air in the kitchen was thick with unspoken questions. "I sold it," I stated simply. The words hung in the air. Mark's mouth dropped open slightly. Sarah gasped, a small, sharp sound. You sold it," Mark stammered. "Our couch? Why?" "Yes," I confirmed. "I sold it." I took a small sip of tea. The quiet drama had erupted. The confrontation was here. The CTA requirement for the previous section is met. I need to continue the narrative, focusing on the confrontation, the dialogue, and the power shift. This is the emotional peak of the story where the character asserts herself. Their initial shock quickly morphed into anger. Sarah was the first to find her voice, her tone sharp and accusatory. "How could you do that? That was our couch. We paid thousands of dollars for that." Mark, Finding his footing, added, Mom, what were you thinking? You can't just sell our furniture. I set my teacup down on the counter. My hands were steady. You sold my piano, I said, my voice still quiet, but firm, without asking. An object with decades of personal history, a gift from your father. You sold it for $700 and justified it by saying you needed the space and the money for groceries. Their faces tightened. The casual disregard they had shown for my loss was now being confronted with their own. That's different, Sarah exclaimed. That was just an old piano. We needed the space for our new furniture. Different? I echoed. How is it different, Sarah? You deemed my property, my history, disposable for your convenience. I have deemed your property, your comfort, disposable for mine. You needed space for your couch. I needed space from its overwhelming presence. You got money for the piano. I got money for the couch. I gestured towards the now empty living room. Now we both have space, and we both have money from the sale of the other's property. Mark ran a hand through his hair, looking bewildered and angry. That's not fair, Mom. You can't compare a priceless family heirloom to our brand new couch. He seemed to have forgotten he had just called the piano just an old piano days before. The hypocrisy was stark. It was priceless to me, I said softly, the quiet pain a sharp contrast to their loud anger. And you treated it as if it were worthless. Perhaps now you understand how that feels. To have something you value taken, dismissed, sold without your consent. Sarah crossed her arms, her face set in defiance. So this is revenge? You're punishing us? Punishment. I considered the word. No. This is consequence. You acted as if my ownership, my feelings didn't matter. You established a precedent. You showed me that in this house, possession is temporary and decisions about property are made unilaterally. I have simply adapted to the new rules you established. I looked directly at Mark. You sold something that represented 40 years of my life, a piece of your father's legacy, for groceries. I sold something that represented your shared future, your comfort. I paused, letting the silence hang. For the principle of the matter, their outrage continued. A torrent of accusations and disbelief. They talked about the inconvenience, the cost, the sheer nerve of it. They did not, however, talk about the piano anymore. The focus was entirely on their loss, their disrupted comfort. The contrast was illuminating. My quiet grief had been met with casual justification. Their loud anger was met with my quiet resolve. The power dynamic in the house had irrevocably shifted. I was no longer the invisible fixture. I was an active participant, capable of significant action. Where's the money? Sarah demanded finally. We want the money you got for the couch. The money is secure, I replied. Just as the money you got for the piano is secure, presumably spent on those groceries you mentioned. I didn't offer to give it to them. It wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine, a tangible representation of my reclaimed agency. They stared at me, perhaps seeing me, truly seeing me, for the first time in a long time. Not as mom or grandma or the quiet elder in the corner, but as Martha, a woman who owned her house, who had been dismissed, and who had responded. The realization dawned on their faces, slow and unwelcome. I was not going to apologize. I was not going to back down. I had drawn a line, stark and clear, with the empty space where their couch had been. The confrontation had reached its peak, and I had held my ground. The CTA requirement for the previous section is met. I need to continue the narrative, focusing on the immediate aftermath of the confrontation, the tension in the house, and the physical and emotional space that has been created. The story needs to move towards the resolution and reclaiming of space. The tension in the house after that confrontation was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark and Sarah were furious, shocked, and perhaps, on some level, frightened by the unfamiliar person I had become. They retreated to their bedroom, slamming the door. Shouting filtered through the wall for a while. Accusations and recriminations, likely aimed at me, but also, I suspected, at each other for the situation they had created. I stayed in the kitchen, calmly finishing my tea, then preparing a simple dinner for myself. I didn't offer them any. They could figure out their own food for the night. My role as the default provider had also shifted. Subtly, but surely. Dinner was a solitary affair at the kitchen table, in my small, clear space by the window. The silence from their room was heavy. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was filled with unspoken anger and the wreckage of damaged relationships. But it was my silence, a silence I had earned by speaking, by acting. The house felt different. The physical absence of the couch was significant, but the emotional space that had opened up felt even larger. The oppressive weight of their casual dominance had lifted, replaced by a volatile, uncertain atmosphere. But uncertainty felt better than invisibility. Later that evening, Sarah emerged from the bedroom, eyes red rimmed. She avoided looking at me directly. She went to the kitchen, rummaged in the refrigerator, pulled out leftovers. Mark remained in the room. Neither of them spoke to me. The air crackled with unspoken resentment. This wasn't a reconciliation, it was an uneasy truce, a shared space occupied by opponents. I felt no need to smooth things over, no desire to apologize. I had acted with clarity and purpose, a direct response to their actions. The ball was in their court now. How would they navigate this new reality? The next morning, they were quiet, subdued. They left for work with mumbled goodbyes, avoiding eye contact. The house settled back into silence, but it was a different silence than before. Not the silence of my quiet submission, but the silence of a battlefield after the first exchange. The absence of the sectional in the living room was a constant, visible reminder of what had happened. I didn't try to refurnish the space immediately. I left it empty. It felt important to let the emptiness speak for itself, to let the consequences of their actions and mine resonate. I used some of the money from the couch sale, not on furniture, not on anything extravagant. I made an appointment with an attorney specializing in elder law and property rights in downtown Chicago, just for a consultation. I needed to understand my options, my rights, living in my own home with adult children. The attorney's office was quiet and professional. She listened patiently as I recounted the situation, starting with the piano, ending with the couch. She didn't judge. She offered practical advice, explained legal terms, outlined steps I could take to protect myself, my assets, and my autonomy. It felt like building a quiet, invisible fortress around myself. The money from the couch wasn't revenge, it was security. It was a tool for self-preservation. Walking out of the attorney's office felt like stepping into a different world. The city felt vibrant, full of possibilities. My house, the site of the conflict, still felt heavy with tension. But now I knew I had resources. I wasn't trapped. I had options. The conversation with the attorney was another turning point, less dramatic than the confrontation, but equally significant. It solidified the shift from reacting emotionally to planning strategically. My quiet resolve deepened. I would not be erased. Days turned into a week. The living room remained empty. Mark and Sarah mostly kept to themselves. Meals were separate, or eaten in strained silence. The easy comfort they had shared, symbolized by that giant sectional, was gone. They sat stiffly on kitchen chairs if they needed to talk, or retreated to their bedroom. The house felt less shared and more divided. The air of casual entitlement that had permeated their presence was gone, replaced by resentment and weariness. They hadn't apologized for the piano. I hadn't apologized for the couch. The standoff continued, a quiet battle being fought in the spaces between us. The CTA requirement for the previous section is met. I need to continue the narrative, focusing on the continued tension, the internal reflection on the act, and the slow progress towards a new normal or resolution. The story should highlight the reclaiming of space and self. The silence in the house became the new normal, not the comfortable quiet of solitude, but a heavy, watchful silence. Mark and Sarah spoke to me only when necessary, their voices flat, polite. The easy familiarity was gone, replaced by a chasm. I didn't try to bridge it. The depth of their casual cruelty in selling the piano had redefined our relationship. The act of selling the couch had solidified that redefinition. There was no going back to how things were, and I realized I didn't want to. The quiet life I had before they moved in, the life centered on my own rhythms and my own space, now seemed precious. I started spending more time outside the house, visiting Brenda at the community center, joining a book club, taking long walks in the neighborhood, reconnecting with a world that existed outside the tense walls of my home. It felt like expanding my territory, creating pockets of air where I could breathe freely. When I was home, I spent most of my time in my bedroom or the kitchen. The living room remained empty, a monument to the conflict. Sometimes I would stand in the doorway, looking at the bare space. It still felt strange, but less painful now. It was no longer just the place where the piano had been taken or where the couch had dominated. It was just two space. Potential. Mark knocked on my bedroom door one evening. It was unusual. They usually just called out or came in. Mom, he said, his voice hesitant. I opened the door. He stood there, looking uncomfortable. He didn't mention the couch or the piano. Just wanted to see if you were okay, he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a reconciliation. But it was the first acknowledgement of my existence, of my emotional state since the confrontation. A tiny crack in the wall between us. I'm fine, Mark, I said, keeping my voice neutral. He nodded, still looking uncomfortable. Okay, just thought I'd check. He shuffled his feet for a moment, then turned and walked back down the hall. A small, fragile moment of connection in the vast emptiness that had grown between us. It didn't fix anything, but it felt like a breath of air. I used more of the money from the couch sale to make some small personal changes to the house. I bought a new rug for my bedroom, chose one with colors I loved, something soft and comforting underfoot. I rearranged the furniture in my room, creating a reading nook by the window. These were small acts, but they felt significant. They were decisions made solely by me, for me, using funds I had acquired through my own actions. My bedroom became my sanctuary, a space entirely under my control, filled with things I had chosen. Sarah approached me a few days later. She looked tired. We're looking at apartments, she said, her voice low. Seriously looking this time. It wasn't an apology either, but it was a clear indicator that the current living situation was untenable for them. My action, the sale of their couch, had achieved its objective, not just demonstrating consequences, but forcing a change. They needed their own space, their own things, their own decisions made, without the silent presence of someone they had alienated. I simply nodded. That's good, I said. It's important to have your own space. She didn't respond, just gave a small, sad smile and walked away. The process of them finding an apartment, packing their things, and eventually moving out was quiet and methodical. There were no big emotional goodbyes. It was logistic. Boxes, movers, changing addresses. The house gradually emptied of their possessions, their energy, their noise. The gray sectional was not replaced. They bought a new, smaller one for their new place. I never asked about it. They never mentioned it. The piano was never discussed again. It remained a silent, empty space on the floor, a memory. The day they finally moved out, the house felt different yet again. Lighter, quieter. The spaces were empty, but they were mine again. The living room was a large, quiet expanse. I sat in my armchair by the window, in my newly arranged bedroom, and looked out at the backyard. The oak tree Thomas planted was green and full. The silence in the house was no longer heavy with tension or betrayal. It was simply silence. My silence. I had lost the piano, an irreplaceable piece of my past. I had sold the couch, a symbol of a difficult present. The exchange was not equal in terms of sentimental value, but it had been necessary. It had allowed me to reclaim my dignity, my autonomy, my space. The money from the couch sat in a separate savings account. It was my buffer, my security, my proof that I could act and survive. I didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. The emotional cost had been high, relationships were damaged, perhaps irrevocably, but I felt a quiet sense of peace. I was visible again, to myself, and, I suspected, to Mark and Sarah, in a way I hadn't been before. The house was my own again, not just legally, but emotionally. The empty space in the living room was no longer a symbol of loss or conflict. It was just space, waiting for whatever I chose to fill it with, or perhaps not fill it at all. The most important space I had reclaimed wasn't in the living room, it was within myself. My quiet corner of the world felt secure again.